Good evening. Welcome to UT Brainstorms. Thank you for being here. My name is Mike Mock. I'm a professor in the UT Department of Neuroscience. And it's, like usual, great to have you here. We're delighted to be back. I have to, in addition to this just being fun, thank you. So many of you have caught us and said how excited you are, and your enthusiasm drives our enthusiasm, so thank you. So we'll have some things to say at the end. I'll talk about parking vouchers, and we'll even have a vote on the topic for November and such, but we want to get right to it. So let me just say that, every Brainstorms title has the word conversation in it, and that reminds us that we're here more to have a conversation than to just give a lecture. We hope you learn from what we say, and you'd be surprised how much we learn from what you ask and what you say, and so that's the point tonight. So the presentation will be about a half hour. We'll get ourselves arranged up here, and then you'll have two ways to ask questions. You can old-fashioned it with your hands, and we have the UT Synapse Club here. It's the neuroscience major club here. They'll be running around with microphones. If you've downloaded that app and you're shy, you can type in questions. They're going to appear on this computer, and what we'll do is go back and forth between the two to keep things moving. Okay? So tonight's fun. So this is Tom Elston. He's tonight's speaker. He is the newest member of the Department of Neuroscience, and I have to say that after COVID and nobody around and everything, having Tom just down the hall from me with all his energy and everything has been a blast. And so we're delighted to have him. He has an interesting history. He did his PhD in New Zealand. He did a first postdoc in Tübingen, Germany, a famous research institute there. And then his second postdoc was at Berkeley before coming here. And I will say that of course, the way that you build a great department is you hire great people. And there's been something about, since I've been here anyway at UT, that we just consistently have succeeded in attracting people that we competed with some of the best programs in the world to get. And I have to say that Tom is the next example of that success. And so we're delighted to have him. This is going to be great tonight, so enjoy. So when he's done, we'll have a good 45, 55 minutes worth of questions, okay? You ready?
Okay, can everyone hear me?
No. All right, how about now? Awesome. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Tom Elston, and I am, as Mike said, a new assistant professor here in the Department of Neuroscience at UT. And so the title of my talk tonight is The Choosing Brain, a conversation about how the brain makes decisions. And to start us off, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about. My goals for the evening are to show you that we have real physical evidence that decisions are a physical process that occur in the brain. Then I want to show you the actual code inside of the brain that informs our decisions. And then I'm going to spend some time at the end showing you where modern decision neuroscience is really operating. So we'll start at the beginning. And to set the stage, I'd like to tell you about a man named Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who in 1848 was helping to blast rock outside of Cavendish, Massachusetts. And his job essentially involved taking this iron that he's holding, and he would tamp down some dynamite into a hole and blow it up. That way they could lay the track. Well, he had a horrible accident, and essentially what happened is that the dynamite went off too early, and it blew this rod up through his head. So it went up through his left cheek, behind his eye, up and out through his head. And what's kind of remarkable is that he survives, having a 3'7" bar shot through his head. But what is perhaps all the more remarkable is that a few minutes after it happens, he gets himself off the ground, says, "Hey, what's going on?" Gets himself onto an ox cart and takes himself to the doctor. Now, the reason I'm telling you about Phineas Gage is not just because he survived, which is remarkable in and of itself, but the reason that we talk about Phineas Gage is really because of what happened to him later. And so to illustrate that, I'd like to read to you a quote from his doctor, John Harlow. It starts, he remembers past events correctly, just as well as since the injury. In other words, Harlow is telling us that Gage can walk fine, talk fine, remember fine. He is remarkably fine, given what has just happened to him. But all is not fine with Phineas Gage. Harlow goes on to say he is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was previously not his custom. His mind was radically changed, so decidedly that his friends and acquaintances said Gage was no longer Gage. So what Harlow is saying here is that Phineas Gage is basically a different person as a consequence of this injury. He went from being a dependable, reliable guy to being rash, impulsive, essentially engaging in such destructive behavior to himself and others that they wouldn't even give him his job back as a manual laborer laying railroad track blasting dynamite. So it's a profound change that occurred to Phineas Gage. Well, in the century since his injury, we have now found out where that rod went through, the part of his brain which was damaged. And what I hope you'll appreciate is that it went really just through his frontal lobe, just through this very front part of his brain. And I think the reason why Phineas Gage might be the most famous neurological patient in all of neuroscience history is because his case definitively showed us that something like personality and our behavior, the kinds of choices that we make based on who we are as a person, those have a physical basis in the frontal lobe. Now, in subsequent years, we've also found out the part of Phineas Gage's brain that plays the critical role for controlling decisions. And this is a brain area called the orbital frontal cortex. So what you're looking at here is a human brain turned upside down. This is the front, this is the back. And it's called the orbital frontal cortex because orbit, eye, front. So it's the bottom of your frontal lobe right behind your eye. This is the part of the brain that's most often damaged with NFL players who have concussions. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a very famous experiment that showed us how we know this is the key brain area for guiding our decisions. The experiment was done by two women in Montreal, Leslie Fellows and Martha Farah. And what they're going to do is they're going to recruit people who have brain damage to the OFC, brain damage to another part of the frontal lobe, and people who have no brain damage at all. And what she did is she brought them into the clinic and she asked them to perform a simple preference task. The idea is she's sitting with these patients and holds up colored index cards, just like this, and asks them to rank, what's your favorite color? Put a number on these, rank these, which ones do you like the most? So if I were doing this, this would be how I would do it. Blue is my favorite color, and out of this lineup, red is my least favorite color. And then what she would do is she would just show them pairs of index cards like this. So for instance, blue versus green. For me, because blue is my favorite color, I'm going to pick blue, and that would be scored as correct because, again, I'm picking in accordance with my preferences, right? Same here with orange versus purple. I pick purple because I like purple more, right? Totally obvious. The interesting case is this. What if it's something like this and I pick black? I shouldn't do it, right? Because black isn't my favorite color, blue is. I should always pick blue if I have the opportunity to pick blue. And so these are the types of mistakes that Fellows and Farah are going to be counting. They're trying to see how often do people make these kind of erratic decisions that are not aligning with their preferences as a consequence of brain damage to different parts of the brain. And what I'm showing you here, this black bar is essentially a measure of a proportion of errors that people make in this task. And you'll see that people with OFC damage do this far more often than people with damage to another part of the frontal lobe or no brain damage at all. As a control experiment, as a way to know, it's again not just that there's something else broadly wrong with these OFC patients, that it's something really specific to decisions based on our preferences. They had people do another task where it was just simply, I show you two things and your task is to pick the purple one. So a perceptual choice that has nothing to do with your preferences. And what you'll see is that people in all three groups could do this just fine. So what this means is that the orbital frontal cortex, this part of the brain, it plays a special role in guiding our behavior in accordance with our preferences, letting us do the things that we actually like to do. Now, the fact is that the OFC has been found to be important not just in medical oddities like Phineas Gage, or just people that you would recruit from time to time to participate in a study. The OFC plays a major role in a number of psychiatric diseases of drive. And so what I mean by that is here I'm showing you a heat map of brain activity of a person who is addicted to cocaine. And what I hope you'll appreciate is that this darker red portion here, well, this portion is more red than this one. In other words, this is saying the orbital frontal cortex of someone who's addicted to cocaine is more active than someone who is not addicted to cocaine. In other words, this would be like a brain that's like hyper-driven on preferences, probably towards cocaine. And we can observe the opposite. In people who have major depression disorder, people who feel no drive, people who feel like, gosh, nothing is worth doing anything and I don't want to do anything, this part of the OFC is actually reduced in activity in these people. And so I think what this all gets at here is, okay, the OFC plays some role in computing and in deriving what we like and what we don't like. If you're addicted to drugs, it seems to be in overdrive, and if you have clinical depression, it's in, basically not going at all. And this really begs the question, what does this part of the brain actually do specifically, right? And so now what I'm going to do is, in order to answer that question, I just need to give you a very quick crash course in neurophysiology to give you a sense of, as a neuroscientist, how would you actually go about answering this question? So the first thing to know, of course, is that the brain is composed of many cells. Cells are the basic building block of all living things. And the thing that's special about neurons, the types of cells that are in the brain, is that we have tons of them. We have many different types of them. They're very, very small. But the thing that's really special is that they are electrically active. In other words, what this means is that if you lower an electrode down into the brain and you get that electrode right next to a neuron, this is what you would read out of that electrode. What happens is that when a neuron becomes active, it emits a spike. And what we do as neuroscientists is that we actually are just effectively counting. We're seeing what is the pattern of these spikes in response to as I make a choice, as I see something in the world. All I'm trying to get at here is that these spikes are the currency of information in the brain, and that's the ultimate thing that we're measuring in most of these neuroscience experiments. So the way in my lab that we address this is we work with rhesus monkeys. And the reason that we use them is because the anatomy of their orbital frontal cortex is directly comparable to that of people. So what I'm showing you here is a view of the middle of a human, monkey, and rat brain, and this is looking from the bottom up. And these areas, 11, 13, 12, essentially the blue bits, that's the OFC. And what I hope you'll appreciate is that it's laid out almost the exact same way in people as it is in the monkey. But if you look in the rat, this little thing, LO, that's the equivalent area in a rat. It's just not the same. And so in order to really understand how this brain area is actually going to contribute to guiding our behavior, to study how the neurons within the OFC guide our decisions, that's why it is that we need to use non-human primates as our test subject. So now what I want to show you is one of the key findings that has come out of this kind of research. What we now know is that the neurons in the orbital frontal cortex encode value. And so I'm just going to walk you through how we know this. What's the experiment that was done to generate this knowledge? The setup is that imagine you have a monkey sitting in a chair looking at a computer screen, and they are working for apple juice. Monkeys love apple juice. So he has a little straw in his mouth, and he's getting pulses of juice if he makes the right choice. and he's going to report his decisions with a joystick. So if he wants the thing on the right, he moves the joystick right. If he wants the thing on the left, he moves the joystick left. So an individual decision, and these are the screens that the monkey sees. So a monkey begins by fixating on a little point, and then you show him two colored squares, just like that Fellows and Farrows experiment. But now, these different squares are associated with different amounts of apple juice. So in this particular case, this blue one is the best one, right? It pays 3 versus 1. So in this case, the monkey is going to move the joystick to the right. He's going to pick that blue one, and he's going to get his 3 pulses of juice. And the monkey will sit down and do this for about an hour at a time, and in that hour, he'll make about 1,000 decisions. And while the monkey is actually performing this kind of decision task, what we do is we insert an electrode down into the orbital frontal cortex as the monkey is doing it. And so what I'm about to play for you is a recording that I made from the orbital frontal cortex as a monkey makes decisions. And so just to orient you what you're about to see, this is an oscilloscope. In other words, this is just reading out the voltage coming off of one of those electrodes. Every line is effectively a different sensor on this electrode. And you can already see a few of these little spikes. Those are the spikes emitted by individual brain cells. So this is how we're actually able to measure the activity of brain cells during the process of a choice. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play for you the video of the recording, and you're going to hear what sounds kind of like a staticky popcorn kind of sound, a popping sound. And that popping sound that's the sound of those electrical spikes of these individual brain cells. So let's see how this sounds. Hear that? So when we talk about studying the mechanisms of how the brain makes decisions, what it really means is asking, how is it that information is represented in the pattern of those pops? That's really the core of how we do the science. And so what I'm showing you here is an example of what we call a firing rate trace from a single neuron. So let me walk you through this. 0 on the x-axis is when these pictures are first shown on the screen. The y-axis is the firing rate. In other words, how fast is that one brain cell? How fast is it spiking? Is it going or is it going pop, 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 pop? Now, what you'll see here is that if the monkey picks something that's really low value, the neuron doesn't fire a lot. If it picks something worth a little more, or it fires more. If it picks something worth even more, it fires more. If it picks the highest value, it has the highest value firing rate. In other words, what you can see is that within the firing rate of this neuron, you can actually decode out the value the monkey places on the thing that he's about to pick. In other words, this is the core neural code that is driving our choices, that when we look at options in the world and we're deciding what to pick, neurons in our orbital frontal cortex are firing in this manner, and that's ultimately determining, am I going to pick this or am I going to pick that? Now, if we bring this back to Phineas Gage, he has basically lost the neurons, he's lost the part of his brain that are allowing him to actually evaluate his options. You know what I mean? As a consequence, it's kind of no wonder that his behavior was so erratic and random. And one other kind of interesting phenomenon that happens to people who have damage to this part of the brain is that it's not, they struggle even just to kind of get dressed. And it's not because they can't put on the clothes, but they'll spend hours trying to decide what clothes to wear because everything seems equally good. So it's really that level, that fundamental level of decisions that these neurons are contributing to. Okay. So far what I've done is I've shown you the physical evidence that decisions, and even something like personality, has a physical basis in the brain, and that is the orbital frontal cortex. We went through that through the story of Phineas Gage. And then I also showed you the physical evidence that we have of the actual code, the mechanism inside of the brain that's effectively determining what we will and won't do. And now what I'd like to do here at the end is just kind of show you where modern decision neuroscience is at. As you'll see, it's decoding decision processes in real time. So to set the stage, let's think about this guy. He's trying to decide, should I get a white wine or a red wine at a restaurant? And let's say this guy goes to the restaurant 3 different times. The first time, he's like, white, no problem. Second time, he goes, white, no red, no white. The third time, white, yes, white. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that although he arrives at the same conclusion every time, I'm ordering white wine, the process by which that choice was made, the deliberation, is different. And that is really the key question. That's where modern decision neuroscience is at, trying to watch the deliberative process one decision at a time. And so to do that, we've had to change our methodology. I want to say this is going to be probably the most technical slide of the presentation, but I promise it's not so bad, and I will walk you through it. So this is what we call a dot raster. And as you'll see, there are many dots. That's the key. That's how it gets its name. And what we are looking at here is we are looking at the activity of one neuron, and every row in this little table is one decision that the animal would make. And every little tick that you're seeing is one time that neuron would fire. Now, what you can tell here is that across all these trials, all these decisions, this neuron is indeed firing. It turns on at about the same time. But I hope what you will also appreciate is that it is super noisy from trial to trial. Like, even if the animal is doing the exact same thing, this neuron fires very, very little right here, but it fires all the time down there. And normally what we do is we just average down across all these trials, and we get this average firing rate trace. And that's what I showed you earlier. This is the standard way that people have been studying the brain. Now, the problem here is that you couldn't read out the thought process of this animal from just this one neuron. It's too noisy, right? And so what we have to do is we need to change what we're measuring. Instead of thinking about one neuron with many different trials, many different decisions, we now need to think about one trial, one decision, but many neurons. And so the big idea here, where modern decision neuroscience is at, is realizing that the brain is not operating one neuron at a time. These neurons are working together. And so the big thing that I just want to impress upon you here is that we can think about the brain representing values and information more broadly as patterns of activity across many neurons. And therefore, what modern decision neuroscience requires is the ability to record many neurons at the same time. And luckily, we have a tool that now allows us to do this called the neuropixel. It's extremely small. So you see this teeny tiny little bit right there? That is the part that's actually inserted into the brain. It's about 1/10 the diameter of a human hair. It is unbelievably small. And along the surface of this probe are about 4,000 individual sensors. And so this is a recording that I made that's showing you the individual waveform, the spike associated with each neuron. And I recorded almost 300 neurons at the same time with this. Now, one thing I want to say here is that, just how you could say every snowflake is unique, you could say the waveform of every neuron is unique. And that's really how we're able to know this spike came from this neuron and that spike came from that neuron. So now that we can actually measure enough neurons at the same time, now what we need to do is actually be able to recognize the patterns associated with I'm picking this or I'm picking that. And so here's how we do that. This should look familiar to you now. This is a decision task that a monkey has been trained to perform. The monkey's sitting in the chair, looking at the screen, working for juice again. And what we do is we have trials where we just show the monkey one thing. So we have these 4 options, but we show him just one. And what we do is we use these trials where the monkey's only looking at one thing to learn a pattern, one of those kind of crazy looking dot images. Imagine that there's a unique one of those for postbox, there's a different one for leaf, there's a different one for blue swirl, there's a different one for easel. And the reason we have just one is that way we know there's nothing else that this activity in the brain could be reflecting. It's kind of a pure snapshot. That's what that looks like. And then what we do is once we've learned the patterns, we essentially are asking at each moment during a free choice, how similar is this activity right now? How similar is that to easel? How similar is it to leaf? Kind of makes sense? You learn a pattern? Go ahead.
What would be the patterns that you were using whenever you show it to the monkeys?
So the question was, what would be the pattern that you use and you show it to the monkey? So this is the beauty of it. The pattern that we're trying to get is something that's going to look like this. So this is inside of the brain. What we want to do is look and see what is that pattern of neural activity when we show the monkey this picture or this choice option.
I kind of meant it as like whenever you're showing the monkeys the two options, would it be like the colored cars that we were talking about before, or would it be like these emojis?
It doesn't matter.
Okay.
The beautiful thing also about working with non-human primates is they are crazy smart, and they are capable of performing tasks that a human would perform, and they can do tasks that are harder than a human would like to do because they have lots of time to become really, really good at it. Now, once we have actually done this pattern matching procedure, this is going to allow us to actually look and see what's happening one choice at a time. And this is what that actually looks like. So imagine a decision that's an easy choice. It's a no-brainer. This is like the white kind of choice. In that scenario, we can ignore this for now. Imagine this is the scenario where it's like the white. This red line would be the pattern associated with white wine. You just see that it just goes boom. It's a no-brainer. It doesn't even consider red wine in that particular case. But now let's imagine it's another scenario. You feel conflicted. Maybe I do want that red wine. You can actually watch it go back and forth. Red, white, red, white, red, white. And I think what's so cool about this is, again, this is one decision. There's no averaging in this. We can actually watch the process of really the animal's mind as it chooses. And this is just something that wasn't possible until this era right now. So I think this is perhaps one of the most exciting times for decision neuroscience. Okay, so now I've shown you really what's the cutting edge, where is modern decision neuroscience at? And to conclude, I'd just like to give you a sense of where decision neuroscience is going. Because now we have the tools to actually watch the brain make a choice in real time. We can see the mind as it unfolds. But now what we would like to do is to actually make machines which will allow us to interact with that decision process in the brain. And so just to illustrate why you might want to do this is that imagine I have $20 and I need to decide what am I going to do with my $20. And my two options in this kind of extreme case are I could buy some drugs or I could buy groceries. Now again, if you think about someone who's addicted to drugs, their OFC is cranked way up thinking about this and way down thinking about that. And again, what we would like to do is in real time, maybe if someone's having second thoughts about it, maybe I should get those groceries. We would like to intervene in that process and effectively nudge the brain to assigning more value to a healthy choice. And so the way that we're doing this, and this is something we're doing in my lab, we have probes inserted down into the orbital frontal cortex as the monkey makes these decisions. And in real time, what we're doing is we're reading out these signals, and we're trying to know when, if I detect some event, can I use that to turn on a stimulator? And as a consequence of that stimulation, am I able to nudge the behavior in this direction versus that direction? And I think what's really exciting about this is that for the first time ever, really, we're living in a time where we might be able to interact with the mind as it occurs in the brain. And so with that, I just want to thank you very much. Okay, so now I think we're going to shift to our panel. Yes, so this evening, to help field your questions, we have a wonderful panel. Starting from the left, going to the right, we have Morgan Mall. He's a graduate student in my lab, so he'd be a great person to ask questions about what's it like to learn how to do this kind of neuroscience. Sitting in the middle, we have Hannah Staley. She's a research engineer in my lab. She has a PhD doing primate neuroscience, and she's really excellent at it, so I think she could also be a wealth of inspiration about what's it like to keep wanting to doing this. And then to round us off, we have Professor Jared Lewis Peacock, who's a professor in the psychology department, who's also deeply interested in decision making. But Jared works on humans, whereas we work with animals. So I think there's also potential for interesting questions about how do you study this type of how do you study decisions in people? I think would be excellent kinds of questions that Jared would be best positioned to answer. Okay. Okay. Hello. Oh yeah, stool would be good.
Hello. Oh, hi. Okay. So my question on that last slide that you had with the chip in the brain, like I'd love the idea of the chip helping me buy vegetables instead of ice cream, but is that chip going to make me vote for this person versus that person or something like that?
You know, it's an interesting question. I think, put it like this. We're now living in the beginning of the brain-computer interface era. And I can tell you that there are people who, very serious people trying to figure out how to not have your chip hacked. So it's not science fiction. We're actually living in that time. So I would say on a high level, probably not. But on like a more scientific level, also probably not. And the reason why is that the way that the orbital frontal cortex represents values is not specific to what any one thing looks like. So what I mean by that is, let's say I love ice cream. I love ice cream too. And I also love fried chicken, and I love them almost equally. And my orbital frontal cortex would be co-active if I'm thinking about, it'd be active in the same way as if I'm thinking about getting fried chicken versus if I'm thinking about ice cream. So the patterns that we might be able to nudge aren't specific enough to push you really to do X or Y. I don't think it will be that specific. Hannah actually has worked on BCIs, so I think Hannah could also have something to say with this.
Yeah, I did motor BCIs, so kind of a different world here. But like Tom mentioned, the field is very new, and I think one thing that is being really done intentionally is incorporating a lot of ethical discussions of the safe use and implementation of these devices. So hopefully that makes you feel a little better.
Yeah, it's still the wild west in this field, as Tom very energetically and enthusiastically explained to us, that the new capabilities we have as scientists to get involved with and interfere with mental processes is a very real capability we have now. But then I'm glad the first question hit on a topic that Tom understandably swept under the rug, which is the ethical dilemma involved in this, and I referred to it as the old Jurassic Park conundrum of, these darn scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think about whether they should, and we can't avoid that. That's coming for us in this field.
So there's a question from the ether world. So there was a question about how things like anxiety and uncertainty affect this orbital frontal cortex decision thingies.
So certainly the OFC plays a major role in anxiety disorders. One theory of it, I should say this flip-flopping stuff that I was showing you earlier, watching it go red, white, red, white, red, white, That's a very new discovery. But one hypothesis, one way to think about what anxiety might be, is that it just keeps on. It never settles into one. It's as if like the mind just is simulating every possible outcome, and it just doesn't land on one and say that's what I think is going to happen. So that if I had to make a guess about the mechanism in the OFC that could contribute to something like anxiety, I think this type of flip-flopping stuff is what it would look like.
It was an amazing talk, by the way. And I had a question. If I remember on one of the slides you talked about the OFC and how you were able to find, like, you were able to measure cells from the OFC. Did you, or maybe not you, but like the study also test for other parts of the brain to see if like that was the only signal coming from that, or are there like other signals from other parts of the brain? And yeah.
Sure. Do you want me to take it, or do y'all want to do it?
You're the expert.
Okay. I'll start. So people definitely have been looking for neural correlates of value. And the OFC is not the only place that has it, but it is the first place that has it. So what I mean by that is the neurons in the OFC that are computing value, you could almost imagine, if you want to make a metaphor to like a computer, you could say that value is like a variable that's going to be an input to some other computation. It seems like a major part of what the OFC, what it really does for us, is it is our value center in the brain. It generates that value and then deploys it to other parts of the brain in order to influence what they do. But it seems to start in the OFC.
Thank you.
I'm going to add briefly to that, expanding beyond just value computation. Neural processing in general and information processing is a highly distributed thing. Tom made that really important point of switching from measuring individual cells and characterizing them very carefully to understanding that, wait, it's actually the contributions from a whole bunch of different cells that are being combined, aggregated in some way to ultimately lead to a decision or some action. And so Tom mentioned that I study humans, and I study human brains using neuroimaging techniques. So commonly we use functional magnetic resonance imaging. So we can measure the activity of the entire brain at the same time. And we're not restricted just to measuring an orbital frontal cortex. We can see what's happening in OFC and what's happening in other areas of prefrontal cortex and in areas of visual cortex that's processing the stimuli. And it's this whole coordinated, communicated, synchronized effort that leads to complex behavior. And so, we're making steps moving beyond focusing on single cells to measuring a whole bunch of cells within a region, but focusing on just one region still is not enough.
I'm just going to add really quickly that coming pretty newly to this field over the past few years in my graduate research, I found it interesting that it's only really become more commonplace to, in primate electrophysiology, to measure from multiple areas at once. That's, the monkey could be doing literally anything, and if you record from more than in one area at a time, you just get such a wealth of information that was not currently available. And that's really been made possible by some of the technological advances that Tom mentioned.
So there was a real nuts and bolt question about how long does it take the monkeys to learn these tasks, and does the fact that they're kind of overtrained affect the way that you think about it?
Want to talk about monkey training?
Yeah, so I'm a second-year graduate student, so right now I'm deep in the monkey training right now. So right now we're about, 3-4 months teaching a monkey how to, to make a decision. You have to teach him even how to drink from a juice. We have to teach him how to use a joystick for that. So we have to kind of engage with the TV. We have a TV they watch, so you have to kind of have them do every one of those steps. But especially for like really complicated tasks, I mean, it can take up to a year potentially for them to learn that. Yeah.
Then I think the question about overtrained. So what an overtrained animal means is basically where, imagine this, if you are a research monkey and you are every day doing these decision tasks, that's like your job. So like they know there's a certain time of day they're going to do it. We call it working. What's their work schedule? And they only do one task at a time. So what that really means is they spend months and months and months becoming like super mega expert at this one thing. And so what overtrained means is that if that's like the only thing you ever do, maybe you might do it different than if you do this only from time to time. And definitively, the monkeys are better at all of these tasks than any of us. I would bet anything, and my monkey will beat you. And in large part, it's because he just got a lot more practice, right? But it is true that when you, and I think you can almost segue this into a question about habits. Because when you're overtrained on something, it's like you're just habitually doing something. You're not really, it's like the lights are off and you can still get by. So another major part of experiments, things that engage the OFC, are things which involve flexibility. So in other words, I can't just have some kind of habitual response. I'm just doing the same thing all the time. The OFC is especially engaged if I have to think differently about this thing based on the scenario that I'm in. So that mental flexibility is another major mental ability that this part of the brain gives us.
So which microphone is, I only see one mic.
Early on, you mentioned the Mr. Gage's experience, and also you made an allusion which got my brain thinking. Okay. You said NFL. Over 50 years ago, I had the opportunity, my only opportunity to meet an NFL player one-to-one and engage him. He came overseas to be with the military. Mike Webster was his name, a brilliant center, very engaging, very personable. In the peak of his career, later on, tragically, decisions were terrible and a tragic death. Concussion was a movie which was made. I don't know if you've seen it. No, was it accurate? Was it meaningful? And have we learned anything more regarding that situation?
Okay, so I haven't seen the movie, so I can't directly comment on that. But what I can tell you is if you think about where the OFC actually is, so orbital frontal, right behind your eyes. In other words, like your whole nasal cavity and all of that is kind of going up, and there's a bunch of tiny little bony bits that are over there. So generally speaking, if your brain kind of sloshes around inside of your head, if it sloshes on the back, it just hits a big, broad, flat surface, so nothing really happens. But if it kind of slides forward, it hits all those little bony bits, and that's why the OFC is one of the most commonly damaged areas in TBI. So it would be fascinating to know, just looking at like his MRI or even an X-ray, and you could pretty instantly tell was a consequence of his concussion damaging his OFC. So I couldn't tell you specifically, but I would say if I could see his X-ray, I could tell you.
Please.
Thanks for the explanation. I think something that I struggled to make sense of was the way you described preference. If I think about, I get on a subway and there's a spider or an empty seat. And I choose the empty seat, but in my head, I'm thinking about the spider. And you kind of describe preference as this like lighting up or what has the strongest signal. So I'm wondering, the first part of my question would be, should we think of the OFC as more of like the counting machine, where these preferences are being tallied up, but the preferences actually exist somewhere else and then sort of are arriving there because we finally decide on something, in this case, the empty seat. And then a second related question would be, do you guys talk about abductive reasoning at all and how the OFC might be related to abductive reasoning or choosing what the right explanation is for something?
So let me say the first part. The thing that's really wild about the OFC, and I would say if you ever Google like neuroeconomics, you'll end up finding a ton of stuff about this brain area. The punchline is that almost any way that you could think about ranking things and saying, I like this and I don't like that, whether that's related to gaining something or related to like avoiding loss, the OFC is engaged in that. Now, one thing, I won't go too into it, but something that I think you would enjoy Googling for the second part of your question is called the cognitive map. And it is, essentially a very big theory which is saying that we live in a world full of associations. This is going to be very vague and abstract, I'm sorry. But the basic idea is that, okay, for instance, I go to a restaurant, and there's a sequence of things that I know. I go to the front, I see the host or hostess, I'm taken to my seat, I order, etc. There's an order. So you could think about those are all discrete states that transition from one to the other. The cognitive map is essentially a theory that says really what the OFC is doing is it's a state prediction machine. It's guessing what's going to happen if I do this. And so within the context of this theory, it would say that value is actually a special case, where value, that reward or that punishment or whatever, is an outcome that a reward state I transition to as a consequence for making this choice. I don't know if that makes sense, but I would say 100% you should Google the cognitive map. And I think for the second part of your question, I think you're on the money, and I think you will enjoy that rabbit hole.
So there were a half dozen questions in one way or another related to dopamine. So people seem to know that dopamine is about reward and about value. And they want to, the questions all sort of were getting at what's the relationship between that system and this.
Okay, well, Morgan, you can talk about dopamine.
So the one major connection I know about dopamine, one of the things that's really known about it is it's really known for kind of the expectations similar to OFC, especially related to you can see the dopamine signaling if there's kind of a surprise. So if you're going out to dinner and you really like spaghetti and it's worse than you expected, you actually see this kind of like negative association within kind of the dopamine. And if it's way better than you expected, you actually see this surprise again encoding in dopamine. And one of the biggest findings that they found is once you lesion the OFC, you actually completely lose these kind of expectations in terms of like this value outcome from that. So it's kind of really showing, once again, kind of like showing with those slides, showing, I believe, like the PET scan of looking at kind of the individuals with depression have that decreased OFC activity. I think that's definitely related, how these two systems are really kind of connecting and working together to kind of expectation, value of different things you can do in your life.
I don't know how much factual information there is on this, but I've heard it said that the sum of who we are at any point of our life is the sum of our life experiences, because they shape how we think, how we act and react, our decision making, and so on. So on the decision making side of that, if that was true, what's that say about free will?
Ooh, I like it. Jared, do you want to weigh in?
That old move. I like that question. You want to handle that one? Yeah, so if our decision making is an accumulation of experiences and prior decisions, and we are more likely to repeat decisions that have resulted in positive outcomes in the past, that is going to create biases in our preferences and in our decision making. And so once if indeed this is an accumulative process, which we think it is, that's what learning is, that after a while, we have carved up our perceptual space of the world, where we tend to pay attention to certain things and ignore other things because otherwise there's just way too much information and we're overstimulated. And we tend to make repeated decisions, as I was saying. What does that mean about free will? So if you start with the premise that free will exists, that at any point in time we have the ability to freely choose our next action, our next thought. I think most people in here would have the sense that that is true, that we are independent, autonomous beings that possess free will. Some scientists would argue that that's maybe not the case because of such strong built-up biases and preferences that might predetermine in subconscious ways, in ways that we don't fully appreciate or understand, how we are going to respond in certain situations. And so I think there's no way I'm going to give a fulfilling and satisfying answer to this question. It's an interesting thought experiment. But I know of some, for instance, fMRI studies in humans studying decision making, where the study came out in Science in 2008. It's a really interesting study. I used to teach it in one of my classes. The task was very simple. They had people sitting in the scanner, and they asked them to make a button press, either a left button press or a right button press. And they could do that at any time they wanted to. Okay? And they said, after you make a press, just wait 10 seconds or so and then make another press. Okay, so they did this for a while in the scanner, making these seemingly arbitrary decisions. Okay? Then the researchers applied neural decoding approaches similar to how Tom outlined with neural pixels. The scientists could decode what decision the people were going to make about 6 seconds before they were aware of their own choice. Okay? And so what does that mean about free will?
Maybe we need the philosophy department to have UT philosophy night or something. Yeah, so good question. So please.
I have a question about the concept of cognitive load. There's an anecdote that when Steve Jobs was asked why he always wore a turtleneck and jeans, he said it's because I can only make a certain number of decisions well in a day, and I don't want any of that brain power essentially going toward my wardrobe. And like job recruiters have been told, like, don't try to power through dozens of resumes before you go off to lunch, because in the back half of those you aren't going to be making good decisions about those candidates. And I guess the two-part question is that a real thing? And if it is, what's going on at a neurological or physiological level that accounts for poor decision making as you try to make too many decisions?
You got some stuff on this, don't you? Because it's about working memory. Well, it's partially working memory.
I'd like to hear. I'll comment on it, but I'd like to hear the decision-making perspective on this, and then I can talk about working memory and attention perspective.
Okay, so context here is that I'll just say the decision part. I would say a big concept in psychological research is something called a cognitive resource, and I think it's kind of intuitive. We wake up with some amount of it, and it's going down throughout the day. And a good friend of mine, actually, she recently published a paper showing potentially like what that is and what makes us tired. That we wake up in the morning with a certain amount of a chemical in our brain called noradrenaline. It's basically the science word for normal adrenaline. And what happens basically is that you wake up with a certain amount of it, it depletes throughout the day, and what she was able to show in her animal research was that creates the drive to sleep, and that when you sleep, your brain makes more of it, and it seems like that's, I know I'm not meant to be saying why do we sleep, but the way it ties in here is thinking about what could be a physical basis for something like a cognitive resource. And the idea here is that as a consequence of cognitive resource, I would say we don't really know deep down. We know that something like cognitive resources exist. We know that these phenomena, these behavioral phenomena that you're describing exist. That is real. But the exact physical basis of it, we don't know. And based on my friend Zhao's research, I would think it has something to do with just how much neurotransmitter is currently in your brain. Now, there's a whole other side of this when thinking about capacity, because that's like a big buzzword in another branch of neuroscience I think Jared could really comment on.
Sure, right. So capacity has many different meanings in different contexts. One context is in terms of our mental workspace called working memory. It's our ability to hold on to a thought or a couple thoughts at a time to guide our immediate behavior. There's only, we have a pretty small capacity to do that. We can really only focus on one thing at a time. We can make a few things more accessible, but really only focus on one thing at a time. And anytime we're multitasking, we're just task switching. We're going back and forth, and we pay a little penalty every time we do that. Okay? And so that's a costly thing that we pay throughout the day, is switching back and forth between things that are grabbing our attention. There's lots of things in the environment and our phones and in the world and inside our heads that are vying for our attention constantly. And so something that our brain has to do is resolve that competition, is choose which things we are going to allow into our awareness and which we are going to keep out. It's a big part of how memory retrieval works, of how we remember stuff, is we, just kind of like the Google of our mind, we search through it with some keywords. That is typically a context, a thought of a context of a time or a setting. And we go and try to retrieve events that occurred during that setting. And in order to select a particular memory, we have to resolve a competition between a whole bunch of different competing things that are trying to vie for our attention. And that takes metabolic effort to do that. Okay, and I'm thinking back to Tom's figure of the no-brainer choice of clearly white wine, where there's no competition between the choices, and the hemming and hawing and going back and forth. There's a competition that needs to be resolved. And I think that probably comes with a metabolic cost that adds up and accumulates over the day. And so if we can if we can limit the unnecessary competitions, such as what am I going to wear in the morning? Maybe that's one way of preserving our metabolic and capacity budget for the day.
Way in the back there, please.
Yeah. So this is more of a mechanical question. So you have this really, really fine probe. So you're doing like an elevator shaft of neuron sensing through the OFC.
Yeah.
How long are you working on a field, sort of a football field worth, or 10 probes? Because if you've got just a vertical connection of neurons and you know that everything is spreading out all over everywhere to make whatever connections they're doing, then that's a vast amount of information that you're missing.
You are 100% right. And I will tell you this, when you put the probe down, it's not always the same, we're in and out each time. And so you don't land in the same spot every time. And what those cells are doing is obviously not the same. And I think this hits at kind of an interesting trade-off because you're 100% right. On any given day, we're getting 1/10 of a millimeter slice at a time, which is definitely not the whole brain. But what we're trying to do is, over repeated insertions, find the hot spot, find the areas that are really deeply engaged, and then we kind of continuously go back to those. So there is somewhat of a search process. One other thing I would just like to add on to this is that there's kind of a trade-off between doing the kinds of physiology experiments that we're doing in the human neuroimaging. With human neuroimaging, you're getting the whole brain, which is remarkable. You're seeing the whole football field. The limitation of it is that the signal is slow. In other words, the key thing that's being measured in these experiments is when neurons are active, they need oxygen, and then you have blood flow that delivers that oxygen to those neurons. And so basically your sampling rate, how fast you can measure what the changes going on there, are kind of constrained by how fast can your blood pump. But when you think about the spiking of neurons, they're spiking at the level of like 1 millisecond. So it's a trade-off. So what we're getting is insight into the really fine time scale of activity, but we're trading that against the big picture. Whereas in human neuroimaging research, you get the big picture, but you're trading that against really seeing what's happening in real time, if that makes sense. And I think that's just also important to realize that with every approach in science, it's always a trade-off. You just have to know, is the approach I'm taking the right one for my question?
Okay. So many thoughts. So the question I have, or maybe two questions, is at what stage in existence is our value begin discernment? And is it based on just how we are created in utero? Or is it
Could you
influenced
unpack
by
a little bit
environment?
what you mean by value and discernment?
Well, when you're talking about like purple versus red,
Yeah, that's perceptual. It's a no-brainer.
Correct. I agreed
Yeah.
with you, actually. Purple
Yeah.
is also, or blue and purple are my favorite colors, too. But I mean, we learn that through our environmental influence in some capacity. So we're, like I may value ice cream, again, we're in alignment,
Yeah,
but I'm not such a fan of fried chicken.
I see.
So how do those values create, and at what point do they start to be created?
Gosh, I can take a stab. Do you want? Yeah. Okay. So let me say this. I think that's a great question. I think that is, and I also want to say that question is part of the frontier of current modern decision neuroscience. So, and I think the way that you said it, it was just, couldn't have said it better in terms of phrasing the question. So that was awesome. So let me say this. From the outset, we don't really know. It's not really clear. Like, you see it in monkeys too. Some monkeys love grape juice, but some hate it. Some love peppermint tea. Most of them seem to like apple juice, which is good news for us. But famously, there are some that don't. And we don't really understand where that intrinsic preferences come from. That's what I want to first say. Now, the second thing I want to say that maybe connects to a parallel to socialization of people, through school and whatnot. Our value function, what we value, what we think is good and bad, is in large part a product of the environment that we're put into. And in monkeys, we see this all the time because we can teach them to do almost anything. Because for them, they're definitely not born knowing what a chair is, but I guess neither are we. And so you really are kind of getting a complete blank slate. And I think that kind of speaks to the power of learning. Now, one thing I do want to say, something if you wanted to go home and Google something that is the cheat codes of all why people do what they do. It's something called the operant theory. And it is real. I know it has the word theory attached to it, but it is real. And it can kind of account for really, really almost all of why people do what they do. The operant theory, operant. Yes.
Hi, I had a question. I have two questions, actually. First of all is there's this concept called like the hedonic treadmill, in which case, like whenever you experience something the first time, you get like a lot like stronger arousal from it than like subsequent times. Do you see this affecting the monkeys that you do research with? And can you see this like physiological process in the OFC, or is that a different part that like kind of weights on those like values?
That's a great question. So there is a fancy name that we have for that in the OFC field. It is called divisive normalization. And the easiest way to describe what that is that imagine I am starting off living in a very boring world where I only have 3 channels on TV. And I know which one I like, right? So my OFC is carrying a value related to which channel, which thing I want to pick. But then a new channel comes, a 4th channel, and it's better than the other 3. So if you were tapped into an OFC neuron in this particular case, what you would have seen is before the new TV channel, that neuron would have been, when I'm watching my favorite one, the value 3 channel, that neuron would have been at like 100% of its activity. But what happens is that when you add in a new 4th thing, something that's better, it rescales the activity of that neuron. So in other words, what happens is that you could be watching that same channel 3, but now you know that channel 4 exists. So now that neuron fires at 75% of its activity, and now it fires at 100% for channel 4. And that happens extremely quickly. Like as soon as it's like almost as soon as you become aware that something is better, you can actually watch the OFC rescale how it assigns value to options.
That's awesome. And then I had a second question as well. You mentioned with the person who asked about the probing question, like if you had like a slider instead of like an individual line going down, you mentioned how there was a searching process involved where you're trying to find a hot spot. Could you maybe go into a little more depth about what you mean by a hotspot? And I was also interested in like how you mentioned that the OFC, it's like the first time that you see those like values encoded. Whenever you like, is there also a way for you to figure out the like hotspot in terms of time, like the very first like activation from a certain spot? Because if you only have one at a certain time, you can't relate 2 different times against each other unless you happen to be measuring like stimulus versus response for one place versus another. And
so when looking for the hotspot, the way that this works is that we go into a different location on different days. And to be honest with you, the nice thing about OFC is you don't have to look that hard. So you'll find it fairly quickly, like 2-3 days, and you find it, and it's all good. Now, so that's how you find it. The second part is there's a great paper, I think it's like 2004, Wallace and Miller it's called like it's called like value representations emerge earlier in orbital frontal cortex than lateral prefrontal cortex. Snappy title like that. But basically the experiment was exactly as you suggest. You just put the probe in multiple spots at the same time. You have the animal doing the same task, and you can just see what's the time course. When do the neurons start encoding value? And then you just say, okay, well, there's a greater proportion of them doing it in the OFC before doing it in another brain area. So that's kind of our basis for that claim.
so it's not specifically like granular, like this like small section fires before this section within the OFC. It's like the OFC as a whole is firing before other spots in the brain.
I mean, I would put it like this. I like that idea. I don't think too many people have actually tried to measure the whole thing at the same time, but so I'm obviously very intrigued. But I would say it's not obvious that it seems like the OFC is functioning as kind of like a unit. And I would say another like deep question is if you wanted to ask yourself like what is the essential functional unit in the brain? Clearly it's not one neuron at a time. It might not even be just a small handful of neurons at a time. It may be a bunch of neurons at a time. And so the way that you can kind of get a handle on this is through something that comes from Jared's field, because he has the ability to actually see the whole thing. So maybe, is there anything you want to say?
There is. I think I commented on that before. I don't want to revisit that, but I do want to use my privilege as a panelist member to ask our speaker another question, which is circling back to the first question that was asked about brain-computer interfaces. So all four of us up here work in brain-computer interfaces, neurofeedback type applications. And just to remind everybody, you were saying you can measure the activity in OFC and read that out in real time. And if it triggers some signature, then you can send that to some device that might try to disturb it or stimulate the brain and change the behavior in some way. Right? So I do the same thing with MRI and try to give a feedback signal in to try to get people to control their own brain activity. My question is, what if we took away that last step of trying to do something about the activity we're measuring in real time to change the brain, and rather just inform the participant about their brain function? So almost all of us are wearing smart watches or have smart devices. We're tracking our heart rate. We're tracking our sleep in ways that we haven't with biometrics in the past. Would it be a useful function to be able to track what's happening in our orbital frontal cortex and just be able to have that be displayed to us to help to externalize maybe things we are not aware of to help our decision making?
Short answer, yes. And I think, one of the big potential applications for these OFC BCIs could be for impulse control. Imagine I'm trying to quit smoking and I walk past a cigarette ad and I really feel like I want that cigarette. And I can't ignore it, even though I want to. But what if I had the ability to just push a button, zap something in my brain, and turn off that craving? In other words, the human can be the controller of the stimulator. So I think in many ways, of course, you just have to hope that stimulation isn't recreational. Otherwise, it create a whole new problem.
What could go wrong? Yeah. Yeah.
But so I think broadly speaking, yes, I think that probably is going to be like, if when we actually do have these kinds of like a prosthetic for impulsivity, it may be something that a human actually detects, verifies it, and then they themselves might push the button.
All right, so we're running out of time, so we're going to do lightning round.
Lightning round.
So microphone people, move around quickly, because the rule in lightning round is you ask your question, they get 30 seconds to answer. Okay, so we're going to want to move around. So you go, and I know you've been waiting a while. Raise your hand. They're going to be running around. We're going to see how many questions we get answered in 5 minutes, or you're going to see how hard it is for a PhD to limit their answer to 30 seconds. Go.
Hi, I had a biological question. How does the prefrontal cortex and then the OFC work together to form that conditioned response and that learned association?
OFC is part of the PFC, so that's the first thing you need to know. Second thing is that OFC is basically hooked up to the limbic system, if you know what that is. So in other words, the way the limbic system gains control over your behavior is it plugs into the OFC, and the OFC then takes it from there. So at a high level, that's the bare bones of it.
Mine's kind of hypothetical psych. Would you think that in like group conformity situations, you're kind of just having that like back and forth in decision making that maybe would be influenced by, like I'm thinking of like the psychological experiment with the lines. Yeah. Sorry, that was kind of broad.
Yeah.
Okay, I can do it. You go ahead. Okay.
I don't know. But it would be interesting. It for sure would be interesting to know. I mean, people are starting to do human beings with probes in their brain talking to each other over the internet, and then looking at what happens to the two brains as they interact. So maybe we're going to find out soon.
Do you think that indecision is a self-reinforcing process. Like our brain gets used to switching back and forth, so indecision is like more likely. Would you say that?
So I'm going to give you something else to Google. It is called attractor dynamics. And there's this whole very deep part of physics that has to do with something called energy landscapes. Also sounds very esoteric. But the punchline here is that there are patterns of neural activity that seem to be self-reinforcing. In other words, you could think about attractor dynamics as the long version of getting stuck in a particular mental or behavioral pattern. And I think if you Google attractor dynamics neuroscience, you will be on the path that you want to go down.
Okay, so my question kind of piggybacks on yours. These monkeys, are they doing these tests separately and away from each other? And so then my question comes in, where does peer pressure come into this?
Oh, I see. I mean, well, I feel like, Hannah, you're the monkey whisperer.
Yeah, actually, we have a monkey. Sometimes they do better when they see their friends are around. I wish the adage of monkey see, monkey do is true. I haven't found that it's very true in training these animals, but there can be an element of social comfort, but they don't tend to, I guess, do exactly the same thing just because their buddy is, but they might get some cues of like, we just fed them asparagus for the first time the other day, and one of them was like checking out to make sure the other guy liked it. And so like, okay, we like asparagus, it's okay.
I'll just add on one really interesting thing. We're actually starting to develop kind of an in-cage training system for the monkeys. So this will be an opportunity where when they're in just kind of their normal hangout spot, they'll actually be around their buddies and they'll be able to kind of start practicing the tasks. So that'll be kind of a potential interesting way of looking to see when their friends are in the room, how does that kind of change their learning and their kind of behavior in that capacity.
Where's the microphone?
So you were talking about having a person control their reaction to the OFC by turning it on and off. Was there any permanent damage from doing that? Because they used to do that back in the day, right?
Oh, I see. So short version is, there are people who are being implanted with electrodes in the OFC right now. So there's a clinical trial going on at UCSF called the Presidio trial. And what they're basically finding is that chronic implants, so permanently implanting a probe into the OFC, could be a cure for depression. In those cases, these are implants that are going to be in there for the rest of that person's life, so it's a pretty major ordeal to undergo. No, for sure not. The fact is that especially if you're doing something in people, the amount of scrutiny that's going to go on before anything happens will just be so unbelievably high. And the fact is the probes we're using, the NeuroPixel, it's a tenth the size of a hair. It's so thin. So also the thing that we're doing with the animals does effectively no damage because it's so small that it's basically not a big deal at all.
Is it because there's more neurons that are more neurons in that part of the brain that aren't being affected by that small of a?
You could just kind of think about it like when you're putting something down into the brain. Imagine you have a big cylinder that's just kind of smushing everything in its path. You want that to be as teeny tiny as absolutely possible.
So there is damage, but
It's so small. And to put it into perspective, the probe that we're using is about 100 times smaller than what's being put into people. No. And you could imagine, just one thing I should say is that, it is a major part of working with these animals is treating them with an attitude of respect. And I think it's really important that we say this, that these are smart animals, and the reason we're using them is because there's no other way to get this information. And our goal is that this information will benefit all of us. And so a major thing that we, and I would say all primate researchers are striving to do, is to refine our approaches to minimize any burden that is placed on the animal. And that's something that is very important to us. And so I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that, good science begins with good animal welfare.
So you are our last question. Lightning round still applies, by the way. Please.
My dot rasker probably looks insane with the decision of what question to ask right now, so I'll ask my shortest one. Would you say that we hit the overtrained mark basically the moment a declarative process becomes a non-declarative process? So like we're learning to ride a bike, and then it's like the moment you don't have to think about it anymore, and you're thinking of the other minutiae.
What do you think, Jared? Do you want to take this one?
Yeah, whether you use the word overtrained or habituated, I think that there's a cognitive offloading process that happens through learning, where when we're first learning a skill, it's effortful and we feel it, and we're slower at executing something. And then what our brain does is it creates efficient little algorithms that it can offload from our cognitive control system. So we don't have to pay as much attention to execute that routine or that process. It happens automatically for us. And that is often quite beneficial. All of us that are driving, I'm sure can remember, 30-second lightning round, I can't tell my anecdote. So I'm gonna hold it there and say habit formation is critical for adaptive behavior, but it can also become maladaptive in cases like when addiction and other things like that.
I'm really sorry we have to stop, but let's say thank you to Tom and We just have a couple more tasks. One is that we have parking vouchers on the way out if you'd like. It's a small donation to us to not take one, but by all means, grab them. We're working hard to get back over to the LBJ auditorium where parking is free and real close, but we're getting there. Second of all, we thrive on feedback, and so that's my email address. And if you have criticisms, comments, suggestions, topics for the future, just send me an email. I'll reply to every one of them. This is our 45th Brainstorms. I think 39 of them are recorded. You can go to utbrainstorms.com, and there's links to there. You can go to YouTube and we have a channel, and you can find them there. A lot of the topics that you would like to see, we've already done. We'll do some of them again. But if that interests you, please do that. I'm sincere about the feedback. Some of the best things that we've done have come from suggestions from audience members. I just want to mention that the next Brainstorms is in this room, Monday, November 17th. I'm the speaker because no one else would. Normally we present the topic right about now, but here's what I thought would be fun. Here's 3 possibilities, and we'll vote, and I'll do the one that wins the vote tonight. But I want to explain each of them briefly so that you have an informed. The unconscious brain, the ACA is a conversation about memories outside conscious awareness. So there's a lot of our mind that we're not aware of, including memories, things like muscle memory and such. And so that's one we haven't done before. Ironic one given tonight's, I thought I'm really fascinated by a system in the brain called the basal ganglia, which calculates value in a different way under different circumstances. That's the dopamine part, by the way. And that discussion would touch on everything from Parkinson's disease to hyperactivity to some thoughts about why TikTok is so horrible for our young people. And then the brain under attack, we can always do something about dementia and this and that. I know that's what everybody's going to vote for. I will say we've done 4 or 5 of those, and I think most of them were pretty good. And so I'm happy to do that. But you can go look at the videos of the old ones, and I probably did better there than I would do next month. So, having said that, think about it for a second, and then we'll see where this lands. I know where my money is, but we'll see where this lands, okay? Everybody ready to vote? Okay, the unconscious brain. Oh, wow, okay. The value-driven brain. Oh, man. And the brain under attack. Okay. So let's take brain under the attack off the scale. You guys help me here, okay? We'll down to 2. The unconscious brain. Okay, versus the value-driven brain. Looks like, yeah? I would love to talk about, you want one final clarification? Unconscious values. Unconscious values, thank you. I'd love to talk about the top one because it's closer to my research, but my eye, there's more hands raised for the basal ganglia one. Did you guys, people in the back, did you see, what did you see? You can. I will do the unconscious brain because I think I'll do a better job. We won't have one in December because it's impossible to schedule a room, but we'll be picking up in January and we'll go all the way through June. Hope you come. Feel free to tell your friends because that's how the audience gets bigger every time is that you go tell them. And thank you so much for coming.